Hello, my name is Nguyen, and today I'll be talking about our work revisiting the Nova-Proof system on a cycle of curves. This is joint work with Boneh from Stanford and Srinath Setty from Microsoft Research. The cryptographic primitive we'll be discussing today is incrementally verifiable computation, or IVC schemes for short. These were introduced by Valiant in 2008, and they're a method to efficiently prove the outcome of some long, continuous, iterative computation. So here I have a function f, which is applied on these z elements and produces z elements. Now, the claim that this primitive proves, or efficiently proves, is that some element zi is a result of applying this function f I times in succession on some initial element z0. Now, why would we care about efficiently proving claims of this form? Well, IVC schemes can be used to construct verifiable delay functions. So, for example, if f is instead a slow-to-compute function, if I efficiently prove to you that I performed f I times in succession, I've proven to you that I've taken some amount of guaranteed delay. IVC schemes can also be used to construct zk EVMs, or more broadly, state machines. So now, instead of these z elements being arbitrary elements, they could represent states of a program. You can imagine this as RAM. And f is now a state transition function. And so you can envision this as proving executions of a CPU on a certain state of RAM. The Nova paper in 2021 introduced a novel construction of IVC called the Nova IVC scheme. Now, while the construction in the paper was proven secure, if it had been implemented in practice, it would have been incredibly inefficient. And the reason why is because in the paper, they use a single elliptic curve group. And this meant that a lot of non-native arithmetic had to be represented within their constraint systems, and hence had a huge overhead. Therefore, the Nova authors instead decided to implement a modified version of the Nova IVC scheme, which instead operated on a cycle of elliptic curves. So now there are two elliptic curves. And because of this, they were able to reduce the amount of non-native arithmetic they had to represent within their constraint systems. And hence, the IVC scheme in practice was actually efficient. However, there was a big caveat in the sense that the modified scheme had never been formally written down nor proven secure. And because Nova attracted a lot of interest on potential methods to implement zk-VMs, this was a critical or potentially critical issue. It turns out that the modified version of Nova had a significant soundness vulnerability. And so the motif of this talk is that if a cryptographic scheme has never been formally written down nor proven secure, we should definitely question its security as cryptographers, but also as implementers. Our work, revisiting the Nova-Proof system on a cycle of curves, formally describes the soundness vulnerability that occurred within the modified version of the Nova IVC scheme. To demonstrate that this indeed was a real soundness vulnerability, we generated a false but accepting proof of 2 to the 75 iterations of the min-root verifiable delay function in only 115 milliseconds on a MacBook. Now, if the Nova IVC scheme had actually been a secure IVC scheme, this would have taken hundreds to thousands of years. And so indeed, it was a real issue. But all hope is not lost. This is not just an attack paper. We found a fix that actually improved the efficiency of the recursive verifier and actually reduced the IVC proof size. And in doing so, we, for the first time in 2 years, write a formal description of how the modified scheme, or how Nova operates on a cycle of curves. And by formally proving its security, we provide now a generic compiler from these primitives called folding schemes to IVC over a cycle of curves. So this talk is incredibly short, so I'll only give an intuition on how Nova, the IVC scheme, operates on a cycle of curves. And so some parts may be a little hand-wavy. So what changed from the original NOVA paper to the implementation? Well, in the NOVA paper, they described the use of a single function f operating on these z elements and a single constraint system which constrains the execution of this function. Now, when we move to a cycle of elliptic curves, we now have a pair of functions operating on a pair of inputs, but also a pair of constraint systems which constrain the execution of their respective functions, these f1 and f2 functions. Now, if we zoom in to the IVC construction, what does an IVC prover actually do? Well, here is a computation trace which describes the prover's operation. At every step, they apply a pair of functions on a pair of inputs and receive a pair of outputs. And so, at every step, the IVC prover has to prove the satisfaction of both the primary and secondary constraint systems, which prove a single step of the execution. However, it doesn't suffice for the IVC prover just to prove the satisfaction of these constraint systems, and hence a single step of the execution. The IVC prover needs to convince an IVC verifier that all steps before this I+1 step were done appropriately. So I'm lying to you with this very simple diagram here. And so what we'll do is we'll dive deeper into every step. So here, I've just moved the primary and secondary constraint systems, and we just zoomed into that one box. The IVC prover takes in as input, of course, the function inputs, but also takes in these critical elements. You can think of these elements as commitments, but they're called accumulators. So we have a primary and secondary accumulator, which accumulate the claim that the primary constraint system and the secondary constraint systems were satisfied. In particular, the primary accumulator accumulates the claim that steps 1 through I-1 were done appropriately, in the sense that these constraint systems were satisfied. The secondary accumulator accumulates the claim that the steps 1 through I-1 for the secondary constraint system were done appropriately. In addition to these two accumulator elements, the IVC prover also takes in as input a fresh green instance, which represents the satisfaction of the most recent secondary constraint system. Now I'll put this diagram in the corner. So now what does the IVC prover do at every step? Well, by proving the satisfaction of the primary constraint system, we not only prove a single step of the execution of the primary function, but we also fold together the claim that the most recent secondary constraint system was satisfied, but also fold that together with the accumulator, which represents the claim that all prior secondary constraint systems were satisfied. So now this new accumulator represents the satisfaction of all prior steps plus this most recent green element. Now, the satisfaction of this primary constraint system, we can also represent as a fresh green instance for the primary constraint system, which gets fed into the secondary constraint system. And now, as before, the prover just proves the satisfaction of this constraint system, which now is represented as a new secondary green instance. So now, the output of every IVC prover step is a pair of function outputs, two accumulators, which accumulate the claim that all prior steps were satisfied, and also a fresh green instance for the secondary constraint system. And now, if we see what these accumulators and this fresh green instance represent, is they represent the satisfaction between steps 1 through I+1, 1 through I, and also we have another fresh green instance. And so now, the output of every IVC step matches what we expect of the input of every IVC step. And so say this was the actual last step that we wanted to convince the verifier. Say we've done I steps of the function. Well, what is the actual IVC proof? Well, the IVC proof just consists of these two accumulators, that fresh green instance, but also proofs that they're valid accumulators and a valid green instance. This involves just simply opening some commitments. So now that we have a very rough picture of how the IVC scheme operates, what was the vulnerability that occurred within the original modified Nova IVC scheme? Well, it turns out that the modified Nova IVC proof could be split into two symmetric halves, a left half and a right half, which consist of the primary and secondary accumulators, but also a primary and secondary fresh green instances. The verification equation, because it was missing some critical hash checks, could actually be split into two independent sets of checks that were symmetric on both the left and right halves of the proof. And it is this missing hash check and the symmetry of these checks that allowed an IVC prover, or more likely an IVC adversary, to completely shortcut the computation. In particular, in order to prove I iterations, the adversary only had to execute one step of the IVC prover, but on malicious inputs. And so these output accumulators denoted the left and right halves of the proofs. And because the verifier was missing some critical hash checks, it meant that this proof, when you put the left and right halves together, were actually accepting. And so just to reiterate, the IVC adversary, to convince you of I iterations, only had to run one step of the honest IVC prover. And so some takeaways are that even slight modifications, even slight reasonable modifications to secure schemes can lead to completely insecure schemes. As cryptographers, if we make a modification to a secure scheme, we should of course prove that our modification is secure. And as implementers, if a scheme doesn't have a proof or an accompanying written formal description, we should question whether we should actually implement these schemes. So that's my talk. But if you want to have a full description, a full technical description, I recommend, of course, always reading our paper available at that link. But if instead you want to listen to a lecture, I give a lecture to the Privacy Scaling Explorations group, which is available on their YouTube channel.
Any in the room? Perhaps I was wondering, so we have 1 minute, yeah? I was wondering whether these things had already been deployed before the attack came up, and how close you are with your updates to deploying it.
Yes, so there was recently a lot of renewed interest on implementing ZKVMs, but that might have been like a couple months at a time. The more concern was they actually were implementing Nova in hardware in order to implement a VDF. And so the potential cost was like, I don't know, the cost of developing like this in hardware. So it might have been, I don't know, like millions of dollars. But if this had been placed in ZKVMs, the loss would have been countless. So
okay, but it hasn't yet. Okay.
But it hasn't yet. So it's good that I found this right before the thing.
But hardware went in and everything.
Yeah.
Okay.